When they cut through the fuselage, there was nothing inside. No engine, no fuel tanks, just empty metal and silence. The engineers stood there in the French countryside, staring into a war machine that couldn't possibly fly. But somehow, it had. It was March 1945, 3 months before the war in Europe would end. A construction crew was clearing land outside a small village near Rouen when their bulldozer struck something that shouldn't have been there. At first, they thought it was a piece of farm equipment buried by a panicked family during the occupation. But as they dug deeper, the truth emerged from the earth like a fossil from another world. It was an aircraft. German. Twisted and broken, half buried in the soil, its metal skin still bearing the faded cross of the Luftwaffe. The French authorities called in a team of Allied engineers. By then, everyone knew the war was ending. The Allies were pushing into Germany itself, and Hitler's air force was barely more than a memory in the sky. But this wreckage was different. It didn't match any known German design. The wings were swept back at an angle no one had seen before. The nose was smooth, almost alien. And when they finally managed to pry open the access panels along the fuselage, expecting to find the usual tangle of machinery and oil-stained components, they found nothing. The compartment where the engine should have been was hollow, empty, like someone had gutted the plane before it crashed. But the metal around it showed no signs of removal, no bolt holes or cut marks. It was as if the aircraft had been built this way, intentionally, impossibly. One of the engineers, a British flight mechanic named Thomas Caldwell, had seen every type of aircraft the Germans had thrown at them. He'd inspected the wreckage of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, studied the innovative designs that had nearly turned the tide of the air war. But this was something else entirely. He ran his hand along the inside of the fuselage, feeling for hidden compartments, false walls, anything that might explain what he was seeing. The metal was cold under his fingers, smooth, unbroken. The villagers began to gather as word spread. An old man approached the site, leaning heavily on a cane, his face carved with deep lines that seemed to have been etched there by the war itself. He'd lived through the occupation, watched German convoys roll through his village for 4 long years. He told the engineers he'd seen this plane before, or at least he'd heard it. It was in the winter of 1944, late December, just after the Germans launched their final desperate offensive in the Ardennes. The village was under curfew, the streets empty and dark. He'd been lying awake in his bed, unable to sleep, when he heard it, a sound like nothing he'd ever heard before, not the familiar roar of piston engines or the rattling thunder of bombers overhead. This was different, a high-pitched scream, almost like the wind itself had learned to cry. He'd gone to his window and looked up into the night sky. The clouds were low that evening, heavy with the promise of snow. But through a break in the clouds he saw it, a dark shape moving impossibly fast, trailing a faint glow behind it. No propellers, no visible means of staying aloft, just speed and that terrible keening sound. It passed over the village in seconds, heading west, and then it was gone. He'd convinced himself it was a dream, a trick of his exhausted mind. But now, looking at the wreckage half buried in the earth, he knew it had been real. The engineers worked through the afternoon, documenting everything, taking photographs, making sketches. They removed panels and probed the aircraft's structure, searching for answers. The cockpit was crushed, the instrument panel shattered beyond recognition. There were no bodies, no personal effects, no logbooks or identification that might tell them who had flown this machine or where it come from. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the crash site, Thomas Caldwell made another discovery. Hidden beneath a layer of mud and debris, he found a metal plate bolted to the interior frame. He scraped away the dirt with his knife, revealing a series of numbers and German text. The designation was one he didn't recognize, followed by a project name that made his blood run cold. Project Silbervogel, Silverbird. He'd heard rumors, whispers among intelligence officers about German experiments, secret weapons being developed in underground facilities, rocket planes, jet engines, technology that seemed too advanced to be real. But this was supposed to be propaganda, exaggeration, the desperate claims of a losing side trying to frighten their enemies into surrender. Thomas looked back at the empty engine compartment, at the swept wings and the aerodynamic design that was years ahead of anything the Allies had produced. His hands were shaking now, and not from the cold evening air. If this was real, if the Germans had actually built something like this, then what else had they created in those final desperate months? And more importantly, where were the rest of them? Night was falling fast over the French countryside. The engineers covered the wreckage with tarps and posted guards. Thomas walked back to the village with the other men, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they'd just uncovered something that was meant to stay buried. The old man's story played over and over in his mind, that sound, that impossible speed. And when he finally reached his temporary quarters, he sat down and wrote a report to his commanding officer. His hand moved across the page mechanically, describing what they'd found, listing the measurements and observations. But he left out the one detail that frightened him most. The metal plate had shown manufacturing dates. This aircraft had been built in early 1945, just weeks before they'd found it, which meant the Germans had been producing these things even as their cities burned and their armies collapsed. The question wasn't whether they'd built one impossible aircraft. The question was how many others were out there, waiting in the sky or buried in fields like this one, holding secrets that could change everything they thought they knew about the war. Thomas sealed the report and tried to sleep. But all he could hear was that sound the old man had described, that scream in the darkness. And he wondered if somewhere out there, in some hidden facility deep in what remained of the Third Reich, engineers were still working, still building, still dreaming of silverbirds that could outrun the future itself.
The answer came from a place no one expected, not from interrogations or captured documents or technical analysis. It came from a janitor in Berlin. By May 1945, Germany had surrendered. The Reich, that was supposed to last 1,000 years, had collapsed in 12. Allied forces poured into the country, securing facilities, rounding up prisoners, and, most importantly, hunting for anything that might give them an edge in the next war, because everyone knew there would be a next war. The Soviets were already claiming territory, drawing new lines across Europe with the barrels of their tanks. Thomas Caldwell had been reassigned to a technical intelligence unit tasked with locating and securing German research facilities. They moved from one abandoned site to another, finding wind tunnels and testing labs, blueprints and prototypes. The Germans had been working on everything: guided missiles, infrared sights, even early computers. But nothing explained the engineless aircraft they'd found in France. Until they reached a facility outside Munich. It had been bombed during the final Allied push, its main buildings reduced to rubble and twisted steel. But the underground levels were intact, protected by meters of reinforced concrete. The soldiers cleared the entrance and went inside, flashlights cutting through the darkness, their footsteps echoing off stone walls that felt more like a tomb than a laboratory. The place had been evacuated in a hurry. Papers were scattered across desks. Equipment had been smashed, presumably to keep it from falling into Allied hands. But in a storage room at the lowest level, they found something the Germans had left behind. Filing cabinets. Dozens of them. filled with documents that someone had tried to burn but hadn't had time to finish. Thomas spent 3 days going through those files, piece by piece, trying to reconstruct what had been destroyed. Most of it was routine: test flight data, material requisitions, personnel records. But then he found a folder marked with that same designation he'd seen on the crashed aircraft: Project Silbervogel. The documents inside told a story that was somehow more terrifying than any secret weapon. The aircraft they'd found in France wasn't advanced German engineering. It was a lie. A deliberate, carefully constructed lie. In the winter of 1944, as the Wehrmacht collapsed on all fronts and Allied bombers turned German cities into ash, the Luftwaffe High Command had made a desperate decision. They couldn't win the air war. Their factories were destroyed, their fuel supplies exhausted, their experienced pilots dead. But they could create the illusion of strength. They could make the Allies believe that Germany still had tricks up its sleeve, secret weapons waiting to turn the tide. So they built decoys, aircraft that looked advanced, that incorporated real jet engine designs and swept-wing theory, but that were never meant to fly. They were props. Theater, the kind of psychological warfare that comes from a regime built on spectacle and propaganda, even as it died. The plan was simple and cruel in its efficiency. They would construct these false aircraft in small workshops, away from the main production facilities. Each one would be partially completed, made to look like a prototype that had crashed during testing. Then they would deliberately stage the crashes in areas that would soon be liberated by Allied forces. The hope was that the Allies would find them, would waste time and resources trying to understand technology that didn't exist, and would believe that Germany was still capable of producing wonder weapons, even in defeat. But the files revealed something more, something the German High Command hadn't anticipated. The project had been run by a small team of engineers who were horrified by what they were being asked to do. These weren't Nazi ideologues. They were scientists and designers who had been conscripted into service, who had watched their country tear itself apart, who had seen too many young men die in machines that barely worked. So they sabotaged the project from within. They built the decoy aircraft, exactly as ordered, but they also left clues. Hidden messages in the construction, deliberate flaws that would reveal the truth to anyone who looked closely enough. They wanted the Allies to find these machines, yes, but they also wanted them to understand that it was all fake, that the Third Reich's final act was a desperate lie, a hollow gesture from a regime that had run out of everything except cruelty and pride. The janitor who led them to the files had been one of those engineers. His name was Klaus Hoffmann, and he'd spent the last months of the war mopping floors and emptying trash cans in a facility where he'd once designed revolutionary aircraft. The Nazis had demoted him after he'd made the mistake of questioning an order, but they'd let him live, which meant that he'd been there when the orders came to destroy everything before the Allies arrived. He'd saved what he could: hidden documents in cleaning closets, buried equipment in the basement, marked locations on maps that he kept folded in his pocket. When the Americans came, he simply waited, watched them search the facility, and when he saw Thomas examining the remains of a wind tunnel model, studying the swept-wing design with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle, he approached him. Klaus spoke broken English, but his meaning was clear. The aircraft in France was a ghost, a machine built to haunt the imagination, and it had worked, hadn't it? Even now, after the crash, the Allies were still trying to understand it, still wondering what other secrets Germany had been hiding. Thomas read through Klaus's testimony 3 times, cross-referencing it with the documents, checking every detail. The old man had kept meticulous records. manufacturing schedules that showed aircraft being built without engines, transportation logs that documented the decoys being moved to predetermined crash sites, even correspondence between the engineers, written in careful code, discussing how to leave clues that would reveal the deception. The truth settled over Thomas like a weight. They'd been chasing shadows. The incredible aircraft they'd found in France wasn't advanced German engineering. It was a lie. A deliberate, carefully constructed lie. But there was something else in those files. Something Klaus had insisted Thomas see. A letter written in January 1945 from one of the engineers to his family. The man's name had been redacted, but his words were clear. He wrote about watching Germany destroy itself, about the millions who had died for nothing, about the cities reduced to rubble and the children who would grow up in the ruins. And then he wrote something that Thomas would never forget. We are building fake aircraft while real people die in the streets. We are constructing illusions while the world burns. Perhaps that is what we have always done. Perhaps all of it, everything we built and everything we believed, was just another engineless plane. Beautiful on the outside, impossible, empty. A machine that could never fly, but that we convinced ourselves was real, because the alternative was too painful to accept. Thomas closed the file. Outside, the sun was setting over Munich, painting the ruins gold and red. He thought about the old man in France, about the sound he'd heard in the night sky, the scream of something moving too fast to be real. And Thomas realized the old man had been right all along. It had been a dream, just not his dream. It had been Germany's dream. The Third Reich's final fever vision of itself as it died. The engineless aircraft was shipped to Britain for further study, then to America, where it would eventually end up in a warehouse somewhere, catalogued and forgotten. The files were classified. Klaus Hoffmann was given a job helping the Allies understand German aviation technology, translating documents and explaining designs. He would spend the rest of his life trying to make up for the years he'd spent building machines of war. And Thomas Caldwell went home. He returned to England, to a country exhausted by 6 years of war, to streets where people were trying to rebuild their lives from the rubble. He never spoke publicly about what he'd found. The military didn't want the story getting out, didn't want people to know how much effort had gone into understanding a weapon that never existed. But sometimes, late at night, he would think about that crashed aircraft in the French countryside, about the empty space where the engine should have been, and he would wonder how many other things in the world were like that. How many grand ideas and powerful systems and impressive machines were really just hollow shells, beautiful and terrifying on the outside, but empty at the core. Built not to work, but to be believed in. Not to fly, but to haunt us. The Ghost Plane of Normandy taught him something the